Okay, so I opened up the D2L shell a little early. Some people requested that I do that, so you have a little more time to look at all of the materials, maybe before class starts. And once again, you have the notes. You have an old pre-recorded video lecture on Adler. Yeah, PowerPoint on Adler. There is another student video presentation posted. And like I said, they're not perfect. Some are better than others. In fact, there's two student presentations. The discussion board this week, it says, please provide some new insights in response to the book, posted readings, PowerPoints, video lectures. In addition, please follow the instructions in the lecture and respond to the family constellation sibling order exercise. So let me, just so I don't forget, let me tell you about that exercise. And if you look at the notes on Adler, you'll notice that first in the notes are my personal notes. They are, notes about the book, notes on what I'm talking about. But as you scroll down, there's a couple different things. I scanned some definitions of Adlerian techniques from a very old book of Corey's that he no longer includes in the new book. So please don't just read my notes. I also provided skills and techniques from an old Corey book that he no longer includes in his current editions. And that's 3 pages. And then after those scanned pages from Corey's book, there's a section about birth order characteristics. And so Adler was considered one of the very first family systems theorists. And what he thought about family systems was very primitive, but he was one of the first ones. So he is considered a family systems theorist, but we're not going to include him on your exam that includes family theory. There's enough other more modern theories on family systems. But there are some interesting things that he started to look at. The first thing is, rather than looking at the individual or a parent's effects on the individual like Freud did, he wanted to look at the family dynamics. And he also thought that birth order was very important in basically our perception of self, others, and our personality. So when it says in the discussion board to comment on his family constellation and birth order, I just want you to look at this handout I gave you in the notes. It's 2 pages long, and it talks about what Adler thought about birth order. And apply it to yourself or your siblings if you have siblings. And the interesting thing is, a lot of people might say, those positive things really do fit me, but the other stuff, not really me. But if they have a sibling and they look at siblings' characteristics, wow, that really fits my siblings. But, none of this is scientific. The interesting thing is our place in the family does make a difference, but it's not as concrete as Adler makes it out to be. He was just beginning to explore some possibilities in the family system, and I just thought it would be fun for you to apply it to yourself. You can totally disagree with it. Like I said, it's not scientific. It's just one of the very first times that Adler or anybody really looked at the family system and applied it to our individual psychology. It also says in the discussion board that you need to respond to your readings, which is the Corey book, any supplemental things I might have added, like skills and techniques pages, and you have to respond to my lecture, and eventually we'll be adding some supplemental videos as well. And so by respond, I need to know that you read the material. Respond in a way that shows me you're responding to the material in an in-depth way. I don't care if you totally disagree with it. I don't care if you totally agree with it. I just want a response that is thoughtful and it responds to the various subjects that are not only in the book, but are also in my lectures. So for example, we're going to talk about Gemeinschaftsgefühl. Might be an interesting topic. He doesn't talk about it much in the book, though, but we'll talk about it in the lecture. So you can give me your thoughts on that and some other things. So one of the interesting things about a lot of these early theorists is that they often had some type of life-threatening illness, or they were placed in harm's way, or perhaps a sibling was sick or passed away unexpectedly. But in some way, they were made aware of our own or their own mortality. And I think that being aware of the possibility of one's own death changes the way we perceive life. And the age at which we learn about our own mortality changes the way we live our life from that point on. So it's something that a lot of philosophers, psychologists, and counselors have in common, those who created theories. So he was also from Vienna, grew up in a family of 6 boys, 2 girls. His brother Rudolph died at a very young age. And at that time, I read a biography on Adler that, they didn't have tons of bedrooms for everybody. The parents might have had one, the kids might have had one at the most, if perhaps they were all in the same room. But Adler was in the same room as his sibling who died. And so he was acutely aware of losing a sibling and then applying that possibility to himself. I think he died of pneumonia or some illness, and the possibility that he too could die. And so Adler himself became very ill throughout his youth. He was constantly aware of his own mortality. He almost died at the age of 4 from pneumonia. So I think this had a significant impact on him. When he did start school, he was a poor student, not poor financially. He didn't do well in school. But he worked very hard to succeed. He later studied medicine at the University of Vienna. So we know the Vienna School of Psychological Thought, just like we talked about last week with Freud, um, you know, included Adler, Jung, Freud, other people, Erickson for a little while. And, he started out in medicine, but he practiced ophthalmology and then general medicine and later neurology and psychology. So he really studied a lot of different things and he ended up in psychiatry. And because of what he went through as a child, one of his primary interests was incurable childhood diseases. And, of course, this was a response to his brother's loss and his own childhood illnesses. He was a good friend of Freud's and a colleague for almost 10 years. He was president of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Yet they argued and parted. And, I think if they would have included Adler's theory of individual psychology, I think it really would have been a major contribution to Freud's theory. But Freud was too egocentric to have that. So, yeah, he resigned in 1911 and the very next year formed his own society for individual therapy. Another thing that a lot of these early theorists have in common is that many of them, because they were medical doctors in Austria and Germany, many of them experienced World War I or World War II. And so Adler served as a medical doctor in World War I. And I want you to think about, many of you may have seen movies like All Quiet on the Western Front or something like that, but there's a lot of war movies about World War II, but there's not a lot of war movies about World War I. But World War I is when they just began using what we call, modern warfare. And a lot of it is now illegal because of the Geneva Convention. They thought it was too cruel to use on human beings. And so we moved from kind of like fighting in the Civil War where everybody lined up and they had charges and things like that, to trench warfare. And, so even the movie called The Western Front, that was the battle line between the two sides. Trench warfare only happened for a brief period of time. But it was a time in history where there may only be 100 yards between you and the enemy. They had trenches, you had trenches. But some of the new inventions in warfare were not expected, and they made a great impact on the soldiers. And so the first thing that was invented was mustard gas. And mustard gas is actually heavier than air. And so if it's released, it sinks to the lowest elevation. So if you're in a trench You can either put on a gas mask and hope for the best, but those gas masks were also very primitive, and they would only last for so long. Or you could get out of the trench and be fired upon. So the trench was the lowest part of the elevation on the front, and that's where the gas settled. The second thing that was invented was, yes, they had like cannons and artillery before that, but the artillery changed so that it could be fired, and when the shell landed, it would explode. And even if the shell did not hit the soldier and explode and kill them that way, or hit them with shrapnel, small pieces of metal or balls of metal that were inside the shell, the concussive force of the blast, you might see this in movies, would knock them down. So if you think about that, such force hitting you, changing the air pressure and hitting you with such force, actually bounces your brain off the front of your skull. So your frontal lobe bounces off the front of your skull, and it injures your brain. And that's called a contre-coup. And of course, frontal lobe is where we maintain a lot of our emotions and higher thought processes. So when Adler would see a soldier, some injuries were physical, they were obvious, and he could treat them pretty quickly. But imagine a soldier who came in and they were unconscious, or they were unable to talk, or they were unable to function cognitively at a basic level. And he had to figure out whether this was a physical injury or what we call today PTSD, but they didn't have post-traumatic stress disorder back then. They would call it shell-shocked or something like that. And so he would look at the entire person as a whole. Now, later, Fritz Perls would call this Gestalt therapy, meaning whole. But I think Adler really hit upon this, this concept that we need to take into consideration an human as a whole person, to look at our clients holistically so that we can best meet their needs. The next thing that he did after the war was, and I think this is great, me being a school counselor, I thought this was fantastic. He opened up 32 child guidance clinics in the Vienna public schools. He trains teachers, social workers, physicians, and other professionals. His thought process behind this is that rather than going to individual houses or having families bring children to a physician's office or a psychiatrist's office, that all of the children were together in school, and he could really meet the needs of a larger population by going into the schools rather than meeting one-on-one, one at a time. So I thought this was extremely progressive. Not a lot of the school counseling books talk about Adler's contribution to the field, but I think it is significant. He eventually lectured in the US in the 1920s, later died of heart failure. There are Adlerian institutes throughout the world. I gave you a list of hyperlinks, at the end of the notes. You can click on some if you want, check them out. So a lot of classes don't really spend a lot of time on Adler. And honestly, I probably wouldn't either. But my professor was the president of the American Adlerian Society. Her name was Rebecca LaFountain. And she kind of brought his theory to life for her students. And I think that that's probably why I spend a little more time on Adler than the average professor. And she brought out some really important points about Adler. So as we look at the various concepts that he came up with, for instance, like going into the schools to work with kids, or looking at a person holistically, which ended up being Gestalt therapy. If you look at some of his techniques, a lot of theorists took just one or two of his techniques and turned them into an entire theory. So as you read the techniques, think about which one of those techniques turned into cognitive behavioral therapy. One of them did, but they don't give Adler any credit for it. I think one of the problems that people find with Adler's theory is that he doesn't have good organization to his theory. He talks about all different things. He doesn't have a orderly flow or organization to the theory. Later, and I have it in my notes, Dreikers came up with an organized outline to use Adlerian therapy with a client that you could follow. And that made the organization of his theory much better and easier to apply in a therapeutic setting. One of the things most people do like about Adler is that Adler's theory is a positive theory, whereas Freud's theory is kind of a cynical, negative theory. And Adler believed in encouraging the clients, because he thought if somebody came to therapy, they were usually discouraged in some way. He believed in the benefits of education and in teaching people. His theory, not only on an individual scale, but on a societal scale. And he believed in re-educating people, and he thought that could actually reshape society as a whole. So when we look at some of the differences between Adler and Freud, Adler stressed social relationships, not sexual urges. Adler focused on the consciousness. Freud looked at unconscious. Adler stressed personal choice and responsibility rather than blaming others for our problems. Adler didn't use the medical model, even though he was a physician. And I think that one of the most important things is that Adler believed that people could change in a positive way, that people could make their lives better. And I personally think that if we don't believe our client can make positive change, then we're not going to be able to help that client. We have to believe as therapists that, through work and insight and awareness, that our clients can improve. No matter who they are or what they've done. So Adler believed that an individual's perception of the past can influence his or her present actions and choices. However, he didn't believe that we were determined by our heredity or our environment. So yes, these things that happen to us could influence us, but it doesn't have to be permanent if it's a negative thing. We can change. We can make our own choices. We can become more aware of what happened. And then we can have more choices over who we want to be from that point on. So I think choice theory draws a lot from that perspective. I think that one of the things most people know Adler for is what's called the inferiority complex. And he finds that feelings of inferiority, or, maybe we might say in our heads, well, I'm not good enough, or I'm not as good as, we compare ourselves, or we try to meet other people's expectations. But sometimes that can be positive, sometimes it can be negative. For him personally, remember, he wasn't a good student. He wasn't performing well, and he wasn't doing well in school, and he felt inferior. And so that gave him motivation to try harder. He spent more time studying. He looked up things in more books. He got help from friends and family so that he could understand things better. And then he was rewarded because he was able to succeed and overcome these personal obstacles. So, that's the positive side. It might give us some motivation. But the negative side is really what Bandura would later call self-efficacy. And if an individual believes that we are indeed inferior, we may not try at all. We may give up before we try. And so we may not reach our full potential. And we'll talk more about that later when Bandura, in his social learning theory, talks about self-efficacy. So he did think that around the age of 6, we begin to have this concept of a life goal. And of course, it's not realistic because they're only 6 years old. You're not going to know what you're going to be at 6. However, it does create motivation for us. So I remember when my daughter was 6, and she loved that movie Zootopia, where you have the little rabbit, and the rabbit wanted to be a police officer, and she tried really hard and solved all these crimes and became a great police officer. Well, my daughter could identify with that because she was smaller than the average child, and the rabbit in the movie was a girl, and so she decided that she wanted to be a police officer. And the way she did that was, she played a police officer in all of her make-believe play. And then when it was time for her birthday, she wanted a Zootopia birthday party. And we were in a Chick-fil-A one day before her birthday, and and there was a table of police officers having Chick-fil-A, and she walks over to them and invites them all to her birthday party. And I'm thinking, oh man, I'm going to have to be doing some house cleaning. But they were nice about it, and they said, no, we can't come to your birthday party. But they all gave her stickers, and for her birthday, we got her a police hat and a badge and all that good stuff. And eventually it changed, and then she wanted to become somebody who worked at a zoo. But all of this pretend play about what she wanted to do gave her motivation to explore possibilities and to learn things about those different areas of interest. So I think that's really what Adler's talking about here. People don't pick a career at 6, but there's a lot of make-believe play, and it gives the kids motivation to achieve. I think a lot of people misinterpret what he calls a life goal. He believed that we take an active role in our own development and positive change. And that means, yes, our lives can be influenced, but not determined by the past, heredity, and environment. The important thing is not what we have or do not have, but what we do. Yet, Adler does understand that each of us as human beings has personal limits. So, not everything in the world is possible. So, for instance, I loved running and I was pretty good. I don't know, I ran a marathon when I was like 13, and I was on all the track and cross country teams and things like that. And but I also knew that I could never win nationally. I could never make a living out of it. I could never, go to nationals. Even though I was good in my own little world, I could never, be as good as professionals. And it wasn't because I didn't practice or didn't try. I had physical limitations. I just couldn't be as good physically as somebody else who was born different genetically. So at first, I wasn't too happy about it, but after that, it helped me to reframe my possibilities in life, and it changed my perspective. So rather than placing so much importance on a sport, I categorized it as a way to stay fit, something I like to do, and but it no longer became a dream of mine. Unfortunately, as a school counselor, I have met thousands of kids who thought they would be in the NFL or the NBA. And I would never discourage them. It could be possible. So I never took away any child's dream. I encouraged them, but I also said, you know what? It's always good to have a plan B. And I helped them to try to find some other interests. So I'm like, hey, man, if you get accepted to a college team, you're still going to have a major. You might as well find some other interest. So they all had a plan B. And over all those years, I only had one, I think one's pretty good, go to the NFL, the Bengals, and, succeed in their dream. So the trick is not to take away people's dreams, but to give them other realistic options in addition to those dreams. When I went on to work with grief and loss, one of the populations that I wrote about was athletes who were not able to attain their dreams, and they had to experience grief and loss with that inability to follow that dream after perhaps an injury, or perhaps they didn't make a professional team or something like that. So yes, we all have personal limitations, but he believed in encouragement and helping us each to find our own motivation. So the word phenomenology is most closely associated with existentialism, but Adler really tapped into phenomenology, and phenomenology is doing our best to understand the subjective reality of another individual, putting ourselves in that other person's shoes, helping us to come close to better understanding what they're feeling and experiencing in their current life. And he believed that better understanding a client's subjective reality helps us to understand the client more holistically. There's one term that's a little confusing to students when they read about it, and it's called fictional finalism. Fictional finalism is an imagined central goal that guides our behavior. So our behavior is goal-oriented, and those goals might change. Glasser would later pick this concept up and, talk about goals. He believes that people strive for success or superiority in order to overcome feelings of inferiority and find personal significance or acceptance. When Adler, remember, everything that we read about Adler is a translation from German or Austrian. So the word for superiority isn't really being better than another person. It's more like becoming the best that we can be. So a lot of people kind of misinterpret that translation. And Adler was one of the first people to come up with a basic assessment. He called it the lifestyle assessment, or an individual's lifestyle. And what he meant by that is he's going to ask an individual questions about every aspect of their life. And when you think about it, that was an early assessment, an early intake assessment. So he looked at the family of origin, any current family or relationships, anything physical going on, what our history is, if anything occurred in our lives, how we are feeling, our psychology. And, so he really did come up with one of the very first intake assessment processes when he first met clients, and that is called an individual's lifestyle. I want to just talk, we're not going to take a break, but we'll end soon. But I really want to talk about my favorite Adlerian word, Gemeinschaftsgefühl, and Gemeinschaft means community, and Gefühl means feeling. So it literally translates as community feeling. There's a lot more to that phrase than that. It's really looking outside ourselves to become part of the larger community. And the healthier one becomes, the less sense of inferiority we continue to have. Humans have a genuine need to connect with others. So just let me share a personal example of my experience with this. So there was a time in my life I was in my early 30s. I just graduated from Duquesne with a doctorate. Um, and I had after sending out 200 1-inch thick 3-ring binder resumes to all of these physicians, a week before school started, I got a call from my friend George, now a friend at the Citadel, and he said, Grafton, I just have one question for you. Did you defend your dissertation? And I said, yes, I did. And he said, come on down. And so I went down to Charleston, South Carolina to begin a new job there. A pretty significant relationship ended around that time with one of my partners. And so I was single, and grandparent died, who was somewhat of a caregiver to me. And I no longer had that support group of all my friends and family because I was moving to a different state that wasn't really a close drive. I was starting a brand new job that added a lot of stress because it was really my first teaching job. And I was becoming a bit isolated, even though, it was right on the beach. So I was slowly feeling more and more depressed. I don't know if it was diagnosable or not, but the first thing I realized was that whenever I had a client, I did my best to have empathy for how they were feeling. And I thought I did a pretty good job. But so many clients would come in and they'd share with me that they were depressed or anxious. And at that point, experiencing my own depression, I realized that, wow, even though I tried to have empathy, I really didn't understand what they were experiencing. It was far more significant than I had imagined. So that was one thing I learned. I learned that now when a client shares their feelings with me, it's probably a little deeper and more intense than I can personally imagine, but I'm still going to try to do my best to empathize with them. The second thing I started to do, being, a counselor, was examine what's going on with myself. But the more I looked inwardly at fixing myself, the more depressed I got. So my first class there, I was teaching theories, and I ran into Gemeinschaft-Gefühl. And I decided, hey, I've tried everything else, I'm going to try this. And it forced me to move away from self-isolation and to begin volunteering in the community. So I started attending a local church and started volunteering at like a food bank. And, a lot of scientific studies have been conducted, and they found out that when we receive a gift, it raises our levels of serotonin and dopamine, and we feel happy. But if we give a gift, it raises those levels of serotonin and dopamine to the same level as receiving a gift. So that old saying, giving is just as good as receiving, is true, even with our serotonin and dopamine levels in our brain. And so I felt good working or volunteering at the food bank. I felt good helping others in need. And, when I was helping somebody else, who I wasn't thinking about? Myself. So I wasn't dwelling on all of the things, the regrets or changes or things I didn't have or feeling lonely anymore. And as I began to work more in the community, I made new friends, and I made connections. and I was no longer sitting alone in my apartment. And I felt more secure in my environment. And I became a better teacher because I no longer felt inferior, but I felt encouraged to help people even more and to work with others. So, you know, I think I really relate to this concept of Adler's. And now, when I have clients in therapy, yes, we look introspectively. We make personal choices and changes that are positive. And yet, if I feel they're stuck or isolating, I encourage them to go out into the community and to find something that gives them purpose and meaning. So something they could contribute to others or the community. If nothing else, it gets them out of the house and it helps some people, gives them something to feel a little better about. And we talked a little bit about birth order. Adler would call the family system. So Murray Bone, we'll learn about him when we look at family systems later. Adler called the family system the family constellation. He looked at birth order, and you'll be doing that for your discussion board. So I'm kind of curious about what you think about it. Just have fun with it. Don't take it too seriously. He did believe in private logic, and when he talked about private logic, it really had a lot to do with kind of unhealthy self-talk or irrational beliefs. And people might be convinced that no one cares. People reject others before being rejected. People are too self-critical with negative self-talk. They may have a discouraged outlook, or they may struggle with poor self-esteem. And, I think this is what he contributed later to CBT or REBT, and irrational thought or cognitive dissonance. And then he created a technique to help people to deal with this. And we'll see if you can find that. And then I did give you an outline of Dreiker's therapy. He took Adlerian therapy and put it in a format that you could use with clients. All right, that's Adler. Any comments or questions, examples? All right, have a good week. We will see you next week.